Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, senior editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on social media. No guest today, so you are stuck with me. Let's go over some of the recent headlines in child welfare and youth justice, and we will start with Washington, D.C., where the Trump administration continues to roll out its child welfare policy agenda, while Congress has begun to move along some legislation. Now, as we've discussed several times on the podcast already, the signature initiative for the Trump administration when it comes to child welfare is a home for every child. And this was the brainchild of Assistant Secretary for Family Support, Alex Adams, who runs the Administration for Children and Families. When he was in Idaho, he had the same goal. The idea is to create this central theme of trying to move towards a 1-to-1 ratio of available foster homes for children who are in foster care. When they first rolled this out in November, after Adams was confirmed, it was just an overarching, unifying goal for everything they were doing, but it has since become an actual, honest to goodness initiative that states can opt into as well. And the trade-off here is you're agreeing as a state to basically report in virtually real time, like on a monthly basis, some kind of key metrics around your foster care capacity, what you're doing to either lower the number of kids who are coming into foster care or increasing the number of foster homes available to them. And in exchange for being transparent about that and working towards that, you get to move away from the very bureaucratic and detail-oriented process of creating program improvement plans for failures around your child family service review, which is a federal sort of audit of sorts of child welfare performance. Every state fails it every time. And so that's the trade-off. You're doing this very public, essentially a competition of sorts with other states. And instead of doing a pretty laborious program improvement plan, you're going with a much more streamlined one offered by the administration. Now, as of the last count, I saw there were 20 states. I think Indiana is the most recent to opt in. So we're getting close to half of the states now being in on a home for every child. And we are awaiting the very public and transparent mainframe for this initiative that was promised by Adams. He's described that as a linchpin for the whole thing. I think his sort of belief is that if this stuff is out there and local media or the Imprint or whoever is paying attention to it, that's going to be a key factor in kind of compelling states to improve internally, but then also relative to the states around them and have that friendly competition aspect to it. The news now, though, is that the administration has carved out a modest piece of money. I think it's in total $7 million to create what they're calling an innovation challenge among states that opt into a home for every child. So that's the starting gate to be eligible. You have to be a state that has professed to participate in a home for every child and inked that agreement with the Administration for Children and Families. And the prizes will be first, second, and third place. First prize is $3 million. Second is $2 million. And third prize is also $2 million. And it's going to go to 2 different groups, I think is how it works. So here's how that splits. The first prize winner gets the $3 million for having the highest home-to-child ratio. Same for the second prize. That's just going to be the state that has the second highest home-to-child ratio. And then the third prize is split. So I was misreading it. It's $2 million split between 2 states. And those states will have the most improved home-to-child ratios from the beginning of the challenge to the end of the challenge. And you're wondering, what is that period of time? States have until June to enter this challenge. I have no idea why you wouldn't enter it if you are participating in a home for every child. And it runs through September 30th of 2027. So you got a little bit more than a year of competition before states will be assessed and the winners will be announced. My two thoughts here: smart of them to start it at the end of June. That buys you a little more time for some more states to potentially jump in, especially now that there is some money on the table. So that was, I think, a sharp idea. My second thought, though, is they really now have to come up with a solid, uniform calculation for this ratio of homes to children. And if you go back, both my colleague Michael Fitzgerald and myself have interviewed Alex Adams for this podcast. The last time I talked to him, we asked him, do you guys have a calculation and what is it? He assured us that there is a sort of internal calculation that they are going to use for a home for every child to calculate this. But so far, that has not been made public. So far, it's really just been AFCAR's data, federal regularly collected data to plot the kids in this ratio. And then it's our data from the Who Cares Project, fostercarecapacity.com, if you want to see that, for the homes. But if you're measuring everybody in this fashion with money on the line, we have to arrive at apples to apples, and it definitely needs to account one way or another. For starters, kids who are formally in foster care but are with unlicensed kin, because that is a thing for sure, and a lot of states do that. I really don't think any of these states will be very happy if the math continues to be previous year AFCARs and some numbers that the Imprint comes up with by asking states. I think we do a pretty good job with the resources we have to do that. And I do think it's an important thing to just have public, transparent data about the size of foster care capacity in each state. But I am expectant that soon we will hear exactly how the administration is thinking about instructing states to count this. I also think as this public competition starts, we're going to see some more attention paid to another metric that honestly might be a little bit more appropriate to assess foster care capacity and system management than just this straight up ratio. And that is the adverse placement score that's been developed by Foster Insights, which is part of the University of Chicago. And I'll have somebody on from Foster Insight eventually to talk about adverse placement scores on this podcast. But basically what it does is it counts a percentage of children in foster care who are not placed with kin and are instead in a non-family-like setting, are separated from siblings, or are far from home. So looked at the other way, if you're not with kin, but you are with siblings, that wouldn't be an adverse placement score. If you're with siblings and it's far from home and that's what it took to achieve that, that's not an adverse placement. So like I said, I'll have somebody on to kind of go a little deeper than that on adverse placement scores. But I've heard Alex Adams make a reference to it more than a few times in interviews with us and in other media and at speaking events. So my guess is, well, it doesn't offer that sort of bright line ratio of homes to kids that makes a home for every child simple enough to sell. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I think it is. There is an importance to making something clear and in some ways an umbrella for other action. It is something that they're interested in, I think, the adverse placement scores. For what it's worth, we actually feature kind of a similar approach, perhaps a bit more stripped down in complexity than the adverse placement scores on our Who Cares website. It's called the family separation metric, and it was conceived of by the great statistician Andy Barclay. And it kind of looks at just population level. So we're not talking only about foster care or foster youth. It looks at that population level at each state and provides the average days per year that a child spends without family among all children in the state. Again, that's just another way to look at it. And it is interesting who kind of comes to the top of that and at the bottom. I actually would love it if adverse placement scores becomes a kind of mainstay. We could see how the family separation metric and that APS score kind of match up in each state. Look, there's no perfect metric for any of this, of course. You can poke holes or highlight a flaw in almost anything. But coming back to the main point, it is apples to apples time for a home for every child when it comes to this ratio, especially now that some money is on the table. And an event that the Department of Health and Human Services held on mental health and overmedicalization, and it was a broader event, although I do think youth were front and center in the whole thing. Assistant Secretary for Family Support, Alex Adams, pledged to heighten the focus on the problem of over-medicating foster youth. Now, this is something that we have covered very often on at the Imprint. Most recently, my colleague Michael Fitzgerald wrote a very in-depth investigative series that we published last spring. We examined all 50 states' foster care medication policies and looked into all the class action lawsuits around the country that were related to this issue and what basically surfaced. I'll drop a link for people that actually want to read through that investigative series. Despite the high risks for children, the reporting revealed really spotty enforcement of federal requirements that state agencies monitor psychotropic prescriptions for foster youth. And there's been ample research that finds that foster youth are prescribed powerful psychiatric drugs at a rate between 2 and 5 times that of low-income children in the United States. Adams was very emphatic to carve out or set a baseline for not being against using medication for foster youth when it comes to mental health. His direct quote at the event was, "Let me be clear. ACF's goal is not to eliminate medication. It's to ensure that when medication is used, it is appropriate, it's coordinated, and it's part of a comprehensive plan." Now, I will say, having covered child welfare for a couple decades now, we'll see if this is the first time that the rhetoric around taking a hard look at medicalization and psychiatric meds in foster care is actually taken seriously by somebody in Washington. We have seen many people say that. I remember when Senator Ron Wyden and I think it was Tom Carper came out in front of Congress and held a press conference and said they were going to play offense, I think was the phrase they used, play offense on this issue. And I know the President Obama and his budgets proposed hundreds of millions of dollars right around the same time, honestly, that those two in Congress were saying that to really go at this issue in particular. Those aren't the only ones. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right now. But certainly, the Biden administration had lots of roundtable discussions on different approaches to mental health services for kids in foster youth in particular. And I just think I'll believe it when I see it when it comes to people talking about doing anything different in this space, because it has been an issue. We've known about it for a long time. I think the kind of preeminent moment that stands out to me will always be Gabriel Myers, the young child. I think he was 7 years old in foster care in Florida who killed himself in foster care, had been prescribed multiple very powerful mental health drugs, including 2 antipsychotics. And that was, God, it's got to be almost 20 years ago now. So we'll see. We'll see if there's action behind what was said at this event. Last thing on Trump administration actions, the president's budget came out recently. I think it was in late April. And I'll drop a link to our sort of annual chart that plots the president's requests against what's been appropriated in recent years. Of course, our appropriations have been a little screwy for a while now. Lots of just continuing resolutions. I think 2025 existed completely under continuing resolutions. And other than the famous Department of Homeland Security shutdown for a long time, we did come to an omnibus agreement on 2026 funding. Anyway, so this is the president's 2027 proposed budget, and it largely is the same as the first one of this term. The big things he's doing that kind of run up against the space that we cover, he has proposed to take lots of little annually appropriated programs at the Departments of Labor and at the Department of Education, and to some extent at the Department of Health and Human Services, and fold them up into these bigger block grants of sorts, right, that are become more opaque. And I think the best way to explain it is he's taking specific things, like, to pick one in the child welfare lane, McKinney-Vento, right, is a program designed to ensure that foster youth and youth who are experiencing homelessness can continue to go to the school that they want. He's taking those things, rolling them up into this big package of money that would then go out to states. And instead of having a specific amount of money allocated to this specific program, it's more like these have become the allowable things for this bigger pot of money, and you can do what is best for you at the state level, which could mean putting more money into what McKinney-Vento envisions in some states, but in other states, they could dial that back quite a bit. So anyway, he plussed up his sort of envisioned Make America Skilled Again block grant at the Department of Labor. That was a $3.4 billion this year. So that was up from his 2026 ask by, I think, about $500 million. The Make Education Great Again consolidated block was roughly the same as last year, about $2 billion. Then at the Department of Health and Human Services, he's increased the ask for mental and behavioral health to $6.8 billion, which is a 20% increase from 2026. Although that is still less, it's still $500 million less than Congress actually appropriated in this year. Famously, the president's budget is the starting gun for action on getting the discretionary appropriations from Congress underway. They take that budget, they work on their own. Very rarely do the sort of big picture ideas like these rolled up consolidations actually move from the president's budget into the actual budget. We'll see if it's any different this year. I think the proposed cut that is most likely to get buy-in from Congress is going to be Trump's request to really ratchet down spending on unaccompanied minors, and that is the term of art that describes youth who arrive at our border from non-contiguous countries, so think not Mexico and not Canada, in search of asylum or other protected statuses. These youth are shifted into the custody of this unaccompanied minors program at the Department of Health and Human Services, and then they're placed in residential shelter care until a vetted sponsor within the United States is found who can take them. So the number of unaccompanied minors entering the country and thus entering this program has plummeted since Trump's second term began. It had actually already begun to decline late in Biden's term as well. So he's proposing to cut, I think, more than $800 million in 2027. He sought an even larger cut to the program last fiscal year, and Congress followed him on that. So my guess is that they're in lockstep, the Republican appropriators, and maybe even some Democrats and the president, on downsizing this simply because there are just far less kids who are coming in seeking asylum from these countries. And so having all that money in that light doesn't necessarily make sense. We're describing the sort of downsizing of this program. It also had a extremely enormous surge in the past decade. So I think in 2013, I'm working off a memory here, but we did cover it at the time. I think in 2013, it was around $380 million. And it got up into multiple billions of dollars. It really got to the point where, the unaccompanied minors program, we were spending as much on that as we were on parts of 4E for foster care. Anyway, so that's the budget, and that is some of the things that are going on with the Trump administration. Moving over to the other side of Capitol Hill, to Congress, 3 pieces of legislation I just wanted to flag for people. And as always, I'll drop a link to our excellent coverage of these things at the Imprint. So the first is the Protecting Relationships in Foster Care Act. This was co-authored by Don Bacon and Zach Nunn and Gwen Moore, all members of the Congressional Foster Youth Caucus. And the idea here is to help states or incentivize states to work on policies that align with keeping siblings together while in foster care, which has been a requirement in federal law since the passage of the Fostering Connections Act in 2008. So what this specifically does is tells the Department of Health and Human Services to take $10 million over 5 years to fund 5 pilot projects. It could be state, local, child welfare agencies, could be faith-based organizations or nonprofits. And these projects will be required to focus on sibling groups of 3 or more because they're generally the hardest to place together. And then siblings with a wide age gap or complex medical needs would also be prioritized. Now, the often kind of cited research here is that between 53 and 80% of siblings in foster care are separated. Multiple challenges contribute to that, including the lack of space in single foster homes, or siblings entering the system at different times, or this issue of having kind of vast age gaps and how that lines up with different foster homes or programs and who they are willing or set up to work with. So we'll see. This is a bill that in some iteration has been submitted quite a few times. I do think we are seeing a kind of stronger advocacy force for attention to siblings. And I would credit in particular Lily Colby, who is somebody who has experienced foster care herself, who more relatively recently founded the National Network for Fostering Sibling Connections. Another legislative effort moving along on Capitol Hill is a package of bills coming out of the House Ways and Means Committee that are aimed at, I would say, tweaking, not really substantially changing, the John H. Chafee foster care program for successful transition to adulthood. That is a mouthful. Most people just call it the Chafee program. And that is really the federal government's main sort of allocation of funds that goes out to states to support older youth who are transitioning into adulthood from foster care in their teenage years. So this is how the House Ways and Means Committee addressed, I want to say it was 2 years ago, reauthorizing Title 4B, which is another significant pot of money that comes out for child welfare services out of the federal government. They're taking a similar approach here where they moved along a number of different isolated bills, and my guess is they'll just get bundled up together. Here's some of the things that are in this package that has moved along out of committee. There's the Foster Youth Housing Opportunity Act that would enable states to spend a piece of their Chafee allotment on housing support services. There's the Foster Youth Post-Secondary Education and Success Act, which would more than double the maximum allowance for the educational training voucher from $5,000 to $12,000. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. There's the Foster Youth Workforce Opportunity Act that would enable that same pot of money, the educational and training vouchers, to be spent on remedial education or high school equivalency or preparation for apprentice programs. That's an important one because it also enables youth who are supported in these ways to obtain an extra year of Chafee eligibility. And that's all built to acknowledge the fact that sometimes coming out of high school, trying to get into college or into career prep, there is a need for some amount of foster youth to do catch-up work and to not count that against them in how long they could be supported. There's the Fresh Starts for Foster Youth Act that would require states to consider legal issues affecting older foster youth as part of their case planning. The Support for Expected and Parenting Foster Youth Act that would enable Chafee funding to be used to help connect pregnant or parenting foster youth with home visiting programs. And then finally, the Chafee Opportunities for New Networks and Existing Connection Trust. Man, a lot of verbose titles in this one. That would allow 2 new uses for the funds, helping youth who have been in foster care at age 14 or older develop sustained supportive relationships with adults, and then supporting older foster youth to participate in developing their permanency plans. I think we've wrote independently about all these bills. So I'll drop our story about this whole package moving, but then some of the individual pieces. I think that last one about sustained supportive relationships with adults, I do think that's an attempt to line up Chafee with the soul family concept that we've had some folks on to talk about on this podcast, where older youth are in control of setting up what aging out is going to look like for them and what adults will officially be part of their life in their sort of teenage into young adult years. The one thing I wanted to come back to, I mentioned, was the doubling of that maximum education and training vouchers award from $5,000 to $12,000. I think the key concern that I've heard some people have here with this is that it is doubling the maximum amount that any one youth could obtain from the education and training vouchers without actually increasing the overall amount of money going out from the federal government for these educational training vouchers. So I think is usually about $43 million for the whole year. So what that means is if a state elected, let's say, to go from 5,000 up to the full 12,000, and they just decided that was going to be their new cap, that means that without an increase in the allocation from Congress, that way less youth would get it. And so I think it's going to be a state-by-state thing how that lands. I think there's definitely some states where there's a waiting list, honestly, probably to get ETV funds. They already don't have enough money in their allocation to reach everybody who would be eligible. But as has been made clear in recent GAO reports, there are some states that are sending some money back from the Chafee accounts. Both the ETV grants and then the sort of main account for independent living. I guess there's an argument to be made if you're sending money back right now from the ETV funds, it's a good thing that you can raise that maximum. And also, in a way, creates a permission structure to not alleviate the fact that you're sending that money back. You're not incentivized. You can put it this way. You could just, instead of going and trying to figure out how can we do a better job finding qualified candidates for these funds in our state, we can just jack up the amount that we're giving to every youth, and then we won't be giving money back at the end of the year. It's an interesting conundrum, and we'll see how all these things proceed. We'll certainly stay on it as this moves towards the next step in terms of the legislative process. All right, last piece of legislation to highlight here, and this is one that we've talked about in years past on the Imprint Weekly podcast. I'll drop a link to reporter Sarah Tiano's sum up of the history around this thing, but we are seeing another attempt by a bipartisan group of legislators to permit Medicaid to pay for foster care placements in what are called qualified residential treatment programs, or QRTPs. And that is a recently created kind of federal designation for certain residential care providers for youth with acute mental health needs in particular. So it would take 5 minutes just to go through the history here. So what I think I'm going to do is drop Sarah's story into the show notes, and I'll drop my story from several years back explaining how this all came up, but I will try to do a very quick nutshell here. So under the rules of Medicaid, you can't use Medicaid funds to pay for people in institutions, with very few exceptions. The biggest one is for nursing homes and for places where older people live. When it comes to young people, you can use Medicaid for hospitals or hospital wings, like psychiatric hospitals, or you can also use them for things called psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or PRTFs. And that's really the list. You're not supposed to be using Medicaid money to help pay for the care of young people in institutions. And the dirty secret is that the child welfare system, and this is not my words, this is, if you read the story that I'm going to post in the show notes from a couple years back, this is the behavioral health lobby basically participating in a story to sort of out this, because they knew that this was going to come up when we passed the Family First Act back in 2018. Foster care and child welfare systems have been using Medicaid to help pay for parts of the cost of residential care for a very long time. And it's probably not been in line with the allowable rules of Medicaid. So when the Family First Act passed and it limited federal funds through Title IV-E for congregate care or group homes, it created some exceptions that enabled the federal tap to keep running for certain groups of people or for certain types of groups. And that was or certain types of programs. And that includes this newly created QRTP, this Qualified Residential Treatment Program. And the concern at the time, which kind of led to people talking to me about it on the record, was now that we have this extremely clinical, defined universe of residential care and foster care that is going to be called Qualified Residential Treatment Programs, it's going to create an uncertainty or looked at the other way, a need for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to start to pay attention and really regulate and be more firm about when Medicaid is and isn't used in these child welfare systems. And the clear answer right off the bat, as states started to ask, is no, you cannot use Medicaid for these QRTPs because it's not on the official list of exceptions to the Medicaid rules. And so that left everybody up in the air about this. And since that time, there have been some efforts by bipartisan groups. This one is a Democrat from California and a Republican from Florida, seeking to simply add QRTPs to that list of groups that can, or programs where you can tap into Medicaid to help pay for it. It hasn't really gone anywhere in the past, 7 years since the Family First Act passed. I am wondering whether my guess is it probably won't again this year, but I do think that we're seeing more attention paid to the kind of rising need for residential care that a lot of states are being open about, saying they do not have the capacity to deal with a rising mental health challenge with young people without having enough residential beds available to them. This is not my view. I'm not espousing that view, but I can tell you for sure that there are lots of states that feel that way. It'll be interesting to see if this issue gets a hearing in Congress, what we're going to hear from folks, or if anybody's really changed their mind on it, because it does feel like there is a fundamentally different discussion about the acuity of mental health needs of youth in general, but in particular foster youth, and what states have at their capacity to confront or deal with that or effectively intervene with young people who are really struggling. One last thing on federal policy and action. This is a podcast, and the Imprint is a publication that cover both child welfare and youth justice. And if it seems like our federal coverage has really focused on the child welfare aspect of that, that is because it really does not seem like there is almost anything being done in the way of youth and juvenile justice at the federal level right now. I think Congress may have a reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice Act somewhere in the pipeline. But when it comes to the Trump administration, it is an absolute dial tone. If you just go to their website, which is a pretty superficial way to inspect this, fiscal notices of funding availability that have expired, they're from last year, fiscal 2025. There hasn't been a press release issued from the Office of Juvenile Justice since 2025. There hasn't been a person appointed by the president to run the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So it is extremely quiet on the juvenile justice front. Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't quietly doing things that might be significant in terms of preparations for changes in policy. I don't know, but it sure isn't something that they are vocal about. By the same token, at the Department of Health and Human Services, child welfare and foster care have become really front and center issues for the administration. So if anybody knows of things that are going on and want to tell me or the Imprint about that, hit us up at tips@imprintnews.org. Okay, we'll take a quick break and then come back with some more headlines.
This episode is sponsored by iFoster. If you're listening to this podcast, we assume you care deeply about improving the foster care system. Last year, more than 2,400 youth, caregivers, and frontline workers from across the nation took the time to tell iFoster what's needed to improve foster care in this country. Their voices are being heard, and now it's your turn. Please join this year's Voice of the Community survey, available online now at voiceoffostercare.org. That's voiceoffostercare.org.
All right, let's get some more headlines. And we're going to start with a really major project that was pulled off by my great colleague, Sarah Tiano, on the topic of relinquishments. And that is a term that, what states call this, what I'm about to describe really varies. We definitely learned that quite a bit from this project. But we're talking here about the incidents in which the behavior or concerns about the health and stability of a child lead a parent or parents to seek the surrender of that child into the foster care system. So the typical way, of course, that we all know that entries into foster care occur are situations in which alleged maltreatment, abuse, or neglect of parents or people in a home is investigated, and then a removal of the kid comes after that. This is the inverse of that situation. This is parents seeking to surrender custody of their children one way or another to the foster care system. And often this is happening as a result, like I said, of acute mental health needs that they do not feel they can work with a child on safely with other kids in the house, maybe, or because they just don't have the financial means to do what they feel like they need to do. So what we did was we have been reporting on relinquishments for a while in the past, done several stories, including some that Sarah worked on in the past couple of years. We went 50 states wide and really tried to ask each state for some basics around their practice in this. Well, for starters, what do they call it? Do they have any unique policies that apply when relinquishments are front or center and parents are seeking to surrender? How many young people enter foster care this way? And then what are the outcomes for them? Do they exit back to their families? Do they age out of the system? What happens? So I will drop a link to in the show notes to Sarah's first story on it. Look for more coverage on relinquishments from her coming in the imprint in the coming months here. My quick kind of thoughts on this, I think the biggest headline, and it's boring, I admit, but it's just how few states had the ability to answer us on a lot of this stuff. We did get information from 21 states, but even in some of those states, it was not a lot. And there were just plenty of states that just were not able to respond for whatever reason. So I do think that kind of backs up what a lot of people think here, which is this is a black box. This is not something that we have a good bird's eye view on. And yeah, that's where we're at with it. I think the fact that one of the findings that we had from the data that we were able to collect, and we were out of the states that responded, we were able to put together a data set of 29,000 kids who were relinquished between 2014 and 2024. So just to consider that just a minimum amount of kids who entered foster care in this way. It's certainly many more than that. One that jumped out to me is the fact that only half of the kids reunite. Now, a 50% reunification rate is actually better than the overall population of kids exiting foster care. It's actually below 50%, and it has been since, I think, 2017. But you'd think it would be much higher when the reunification is contingent on youth being treated and not parent circumstances. The idea is I need to surrender my child because I can't afford the care that they need, or I'm worried about other people in my house, and so the help needs to come somewhere else. You would think that those would be situations where an intervention would occur and then things would go back to some semblance of normal. In about half the cases, that's from what we were able to gather, that is not what happens. And then the other one is the fact that of what we could put together, only about 9% of those cases were identified by states as being children who have been adopted. And that sort of runs counter to the fact that in much of the news reporting on this issue, including in our stories, the people who we have found to speak with and who other reporters have found to speak with about relinquishment are very often and almost always children of adoptive parents, children who had been adopted. You might have seen the Associated Press come out with a very large story that they recently published about adopted children ending up in residential care. And it includes this quote, experts say adoptees, only 2% of American children, account for an estimated 25 to 40% of placements in residential treatment. My antenna always goes up when like a stat like that is cited without the official source. But there is a 2016 report that pegs it. I think they did a survey of 50 or 60 residential treatment programs, and their range was 25 to 30%. So these guys, the reporters for the AP, must have found an upper bound from experts as well. So, what we found doesn't completely align there to me. And so I've been thinking about what are the reasons for that? What could the reasons be that we found such a low percentage of these cases came from adoptive parents and children as compared to what that AP story might suggest, or the fact that all the anecdotal stories that we have reported on tend to be of adopted children. I think one is just that the data is messed up and that what was reported to us isn't catching all of the kids who are adopted all of the time. I think one reason that could be, I've certainly heard this, I know that Sarah has from other states, is that the fact that when children are adopted, whether it's from foster care or anywhere else, their name might change, their social security number might change. And so it's not necessarily a slam dunk that every child who was relinquished and entered foster care that way, who had been adopted in the past, necessarily would surface in numbers as somebody was like responding to a query from us. It is also possible that a lot of adoptees could be getting care through another fiscal path than foster care. So there may be quite a lot of adopted children whose parents feel they need significant help, but they don't relinquish them or don't seek to go that route because they are able to get access to the financial help that can be necessary to work with kids in residential care in another way. And so we don't see it as an entry into foster care. That's a possibility. The other possibility is we just caught a bad slice and the totality of this, if every state was able to respond perfectly to us on all the things we asked about, would tell a different story. And just based on who we heard from and what they were able to provide, we get a sample that is not necessarily demonstrative, because we weren't looking for a sample. This wasn't a research project. We were just trying to find out what states could tell us. But it's a super interesting situation, I think, for a lot of reasons. And we'll continue to report on it. I will plug, if you have interesting thoughts on either our coverage or this in general, tips at imprintnews.org. Hit us up with those. I think that it's a small number relative to the total number of kids who enter foster care, but it is almost entirely, I am hypothesizing here because we didn't necessarily ask this, but it's almost entirely kids who are entering foster care into group settings, into congregate care. And that does two interesting things. One is it makes the number of foster youth living in congregate care seem higher than it is, I would think, because these are kids who are entering foster care to access residential care at the behest of their parents. That's very different than the systemic decision to place a kid in congregate care. In some ways, it's a similar motive, but it's a different dynamic. And so it does make it seem, I think, at least in some states, as there's more kids that are being placed in congregate care as foster youth than actually are. And then related to that, this is, again, a very small group. But I think the reason that when we talk to people about this, especially former directors, they know that this is a serious issue. And I think that's because when you're talking about a small group of kids who enter with high acuity needs and are all going into congregate care, even if they're just a very tiny percentage of your foster care population, they're not a tiny percentage of what you're spending money on. And money is in some places, and a lot of places, a zero-sum proposition. If you're spending a lot of money on a very small group of kids with high needs in your foster care system, that's money that you're not spending on something else, potentially. So it's something that we're going to continue to report on, and really worth a read. It's the first of several pieces that Sarah's going to do on this, and it was really well put together. Let me run through a couple of pieces I saw elsewhere, and then I want to wrap up just recommending some Imprint pieces. Read the Connecticut Mirror's story from mid-May about staff turnover at the Department of Children and Families there. I think this is obviously something we've talked about a lot on the podcast, both with the juvenile justice and child welfare system. Really, since the days of the Great Resignation after COVID, things have, in plenty of places, not gotten all that much better in terms of vacancies and high turnover at some of these systems. I think what was particularly good about this story, first, I just think the Connecticut Mirror I just want to shout them out as an outlet that has consistently and through multiple reporters done a very good job of reporting on the child welfare system, in my opinion, and juvenile justice. I think they just have really good nuanced stuff. So I'm just assuming that they have some editors and some people with some institutional knowledge there that really know what they're talking about. But this story, I think it gets to the systemic impact of that. What does it mean for the system itself? But they led with how that translates to the kids. The beginning of this talks about a young woman who had a caseworker who was really great and really helped her, and then all of a sudden was gone, and how that feels to have that happen, especially after, and I'm relaying the experience of this young woman, she had some not so great caseworkers. So finally one surfaced, and then as soon as they were there, they were gone. And what that does to somebody that's in the system. So that's a really good piece. I'll drop it in the show notes. A couple months ago, we had Mark Schindler on the podcast to talk about the Forgotten Children's Initiative, which was born of research that he led when he was chief of staff to Vinnie Schiraldi when they were running the Maryland Juvenile Justice Agency. And this was a research project in the history of the Maryland House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children, which existed between 1877 and 1939. As part of that research, it was discovered that 300 kids were buried in an unmarked cemetery near where the House of Reformation was located in Cheltenham, Maryland. I'm just bringing it up again to say that project has really started to get a new round of attention in the media there. I'm going to drop some links for people that want to read about what's being reported on this as the Forgotten Children Initiative has gained prominence, or I'm not taking credit for this. I'm not saying that we did a podcast and then this all got coverage. They've been working on this for a long time. I'm just saying it's for a lot of, I know there's some listeners here that work on advocacy and work on how to communicate and get attention to things. This seems to be a very vibrant example of a way in which they've framed something dark about history that needed its own reflection upon by society, but then also have an extrapolated meaning, a more modern meaning to it as well. So I'll drop some links to that, including one that covers the fact that they actually finally have a historical marker for this thing. I think one of the truly dark things is that people have known about this burial ground and not bothered to commemorate it or acknowledge it in any way. So anyway, I will leave that for you to read if you want. Another piece I want to raise up, this is out of Oklahoma and is from the local Fox affiliate there, I think, this story, that covers House Bill 4421, which is known as Leo's Law, and it is named after Leo Toe, I think I'm hoping I pronounced that right, Towe, who is a 3-year-old who died in his mother's care after ingesting fentanyl. And so what this bill does is changes the laws around what happens in a child protection investigation when drugs are involved. So I'll just read a little bit of the sort of what changes under this law, and I'm reading here from the official summary of it. Upon receipt of a report that a child may be drug endangered, the Department of Human Services has 24 hours to conduct a safety analysis and must attempt to acquire consent for an immediate drug screening for any parent, guardian, or caregiver if substance abuse is suspected, including the use of methamphetamines, opioids, or any indication of fentanyl presence. If such individuals refuse to consent to a drug screening, the department must report to a district attorney within 24 hours to request a court order for the drug screening. All drug screenings must include mandatory fentanyl testing. And it also adds exposing a child to fentanyl under child endangerment as a felony. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is because of this sort of an afterthought line in the local coverage here from the Fox affiliate. But they write, while other states have laws addressing drug exposure and child safety, Oklahoma's proposal would expand those measures further than existing statutes elsewhere. And Leo's dad is quoted right afterwards as saying, "Here in Oklahoma, our children's lives matter. This is about kids and protecting them from the dangers of fentanyl." And so the reason I wanted to raise this up in particular, because obviously there's lots of state laws that get considered every year in the child welfare space, but what jumped out to me here is the fact that we had talked before on this podcast about the difference in danger, frankly, between fentanyl and every other drug. And plenty of those drugs, if ingested by a child, are very dangerous. Fentanyl is on a whole other level in terms of if a kid gets some on their hand and ingests it, the likelihood of fatality is just much more high. It's just more dangerous. And what you're seeing here with this bill is, I think you would describe this as like the fentanyl child welfare bill, right? Or something like that. But if you look at like the details of what actually ends up happening, this is the very meaningful and reasonable concern about fentanyl ingestion by toddlers driving changes overall in the policy response. And I'm not raising this in opposition to what this law says or in support of it. I'm saying that this is an example, and I don't know necessarily if the Fox affiliate is correct that this is far and above and beyond any other state and what they do in this space when it comes to child protection. But this is an example of a very specific, very concerning, and very small subset of the child protection world driving a much bigger policy shift in a state. And I think that this won't be the last time you have this happen. I think that this is not the only state where fentanyl ingestion has come up. Minnesota had an organization do an assessment of child fatalities, which are it's a small subset of the kids who are involved in systems or even not involved in systems who end up actually dying. But In that study, again, it's a very small number of kids who died as a result of fentanyl ingestion, but that small number has gone way, way up. Washington State, in its child maltreatment reports, has noted dramatic increases in the number of kids who died or nearly died as a result of fentanyl ingestion. I don't know what to say other than I think that this is, if nothing else, it's a signal for everybody to really have open conversations about the presence of fentanyl, what, if anything, is different about it, and how we address it from a child dependency standpoint. Because there's the criminal system, and then there's the way that you keep kids safe. And I think that this is an example of sort of, I don't think this is the only state we're going to see a version of a Leo's Law be introduced. All right, I've been yakking for way too long. I just want to close out recommending real quick some other stories from Imprint reporters that I thought were really great in the last month or so. One is a report about a policy brief or some research done by Stanford University that provides some new insight into why, in particular, California foster youth miss school at a rate that is way out of line with sort of the general population of kids. Interestingly, in surveying 4 large California school districts, what they found was that the school interruptions for foster youth were pinpointed to 2 different periods. When they came in, so that time right as they were entering foster care from their family or their caregiver, and then also as they were reunified. So I think that's an interesting new aspect to this. I think we largely know in the system that educational stability has been a big problem for a long time. And again, something that the federal government and Congress has tried to address in federal law. This provides some kind of clarity on exactly when, as opposed to just thinking of it as just something that's always going wrong for youth who are in foster care. That story was by Jeremy Loudenbeck, our California reporter. He also wrote a story kind of covering what California is trying to do to protect current and former foster youth from facing cuts to their SNAP benefits, which were part of the Big Beautiful Bill that passed last year. This was largely a tax cut bill, but changed some major federal spending. And one of the things that it did was remove a protection for current and former foster youth up to the age of 25 from work requirements related to getting food stamps or SNAP, or in California, it's called CalFresh. So what California is trying to do here with this legislation is basically require the state to seek a waiver from the federal government that would protect and reinstate via waiver the protection for current and former foster youth up to 25. Now, since this administration supported the bill, I don't really know if they'll be amenable to that waiver, but it's certainly an instruction from the state to the governor. You're going to at least have to try, because we believe in protecting that. All right, home stretch here. The Imprint, I wanted to just flag that we have joined the Global Indigenous Journalism Network at the Associated Press. And so we will be contributing coverage of Indigenous children and families to its members. This is an extremely exciting opportunity for us, and we're so appreciative to the Associated Press for including us in the Global Indigenous Journalism Network. We have our readers here at the Imprint, and we're really proud of building this Indigenous children and families beat with our reporter Nancy Marie Spears over the last several years here, connecting to the broader membership of AP and having that opportunity to see our stories disseminated that way is incredible. It means that there's potentially thousands and thousands more people who will read the really great stuff that Nancy Marie is reporting on us for. So I'm going to drop a link in the show notes to kind of our first foray into this network. Nancy Marie Spears was on the ground in Colorado Springs covering activities there during a week in which there were days of awareness held for missing and murdered Indigenous people all over the country. So I'll include a link to the story that she worked on with other AP reporters, and then one particularly about that Colorado Springs experience. And then the last one I just want to call out was this terrific piece put together by our Georgia reporter, Jordan Anderson, and our editors on the See Me project in Georgia. It's produced or led by Georgia Appleseed, which is an advocacy group there, and it's helped dozens of foster teens in group homes turn their lived experience into paintings or poems or sculptures. Liz McDaniels, who directs engagement for Georgia Appleseed, described this as raising awareness about foster care experiences without forcing young people into an unwanted spotlight. And that's the sort of goal of the initiative. There is a gallery of the sort of physical artwork that Jordan was able to have access to, took some great pictures. So they did a really good job just setting it all up and explaining it in this piece, and then really letting the artwork and the young people's descriptions of their artwork carry the load. And so I would really recommend it. I'll drop a link to it. I will say personally, the one that kind of struck me the hardest is a painting called When Life Gives You Lemons, Make Lemonade. And I'm just going to read from the anonymous producer of that art and their description of it. Life has given me many lemons, and the best I could do is make sour lemonade. The more I grow, the greater I get. The little flowers are me, unbloomed, because I have troubles with my behavior. But I'm not finished yet. I'm still a work in progress. My act has been messy, and the lemons have taken over, so I try to make it clean and make lemonade. That'll do it for the Imprint Weekly Podcast this week. Thanks to iFoster for sponsoring this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.